Welcome to The Spirit of Business, episode number 86, The New Science of Business, with Matt Murphy and Sarah McCrum.
Hi, Sarah.
Hi, Matt. We've got something special happening today. We've had a lot of Matt and Sarah recently. So I've invited somebody to join us today. I'm actually very excited about this. I heard about Jude Caravan years ago. I've got a friend who talks about her all the time, and I was always like, when am I going to meet Jude? And he always say, oh wait, the time will come, the time will come. And finally the time came just maybe about a month ago, and we were speaking in the same event. In fact, I think we were in two things in a very short space of time together. And so the time has come, and what's really fascinating about Jude, she's a cosmologist, and she also has a very strong background in business. And I just thought, what better combination for something that's about the spirit of business than to bring cosmology and business together in this conversation. So Jude, I'm really happy to see you and to have you joining us here today.
Well, Sarah, Matt, thank you so much. And I love that even though I've got up very early in the morning, I'm actually speaking to two folks who are living in one of my favourite countries in the world, Australia. So it's a joy to be with you both today.
Thank you. I think it would be great if you could start to just tell us a little bit about who you are, because business and cosmology would seem to most of us pretty far apart, and it's very easy words to say. Can you tell us what it is from your side?
I'll do my best. I think it's fair to say that my life has been a scenic journey to this point. And I describe myself as a cosmologist because I've been curious about the nature of reality all my life. And I think at the heart of cosmology is that curiosity to know not just how our universe is as it is, but why it is as it is. And mine perhaps took a sort of more expansive way than most other cosmologists, in the sense that from the age of 4, I was experiencing multidimensional realities. So I was having out-of-body experiences. I was having communications with discarnate entities, as you do when you're 4 years old. And I'm sure many children do when they're 4 years old. And most are told, don't be silly, it's your imagination. Well, I never told anybody about my experiences. So I never got that sort of shut down. And it's been a lifelong journey of the essentially walking between worlds. So when I talk of cosmology, I'm speaking of the nature of reality as literally expansive to the wholeness of multidimensional realities. And that's where spirited comes in, because that are those spiritual dimensions of the nature of reality and consciousness. So as a cosmologist, I research leading edge science, but I do so also in terms of leading edge research into consciousness, the nature of consciousness, and weave together the ancient understanding, because now the new science is coming to stand alongside that ancient perspective and traditions, universal wisdom teachings, indigenous wisdom teachings, spiritual traditions of all sorts, into a literally holistic, what I call whole world view of the nature of reality. So that's my lifelong journey. And along the way, I became I studied at Oxford University, physics, quantum physics. I then became an accountant, as you do, and went
as you did,
as well as I did. This is true. Not too many people do. Became an accountant, became one of the most senior business women in the UK in the early 90s, literally working in 36 countries. And also then, having left corporate life in the mid-90s, realizing that something really big was on the way. I also did a PhD in archaeology, researching ancient cosmology. So I'm an archaeologist as well. So as I say, when I talk about scenic route, I'm being born as the daughter and granddaughter of coal miners in the north of England. You know, it's been a long route, it's been a scenic route, it's been a fascinating journey. And it's a journey of curiosity that continues to this day and is ongoing.
Can I just interject there for a second and just say, oh my goodness gracious me, the journey that you've had from the age of 4 that you've experienced through to all the teachings and learnings and the qualifications, and love the fact that you're an accountant, given the fact that I'm one at heart. So I don't understand how that paradigm or how that actually occurred when you talked about your full history and you said, and I became an accountant and a business leader and that sort of type thing along the way. But such a fascinating journey, and one where you would get so many different perspectives. And I've got probably about 400 million questions that I'd like to ask, and we probably don't have enough time to answer them all today. But just an amazing, just want to acknowledge firstly the amazing journey that you've had and experience, and thank you for joining us today.
Well, I have a question. What I'm fascinated by, probably because it's something that's so close to my own heart and my own work, is what your exploration of the nature of reality has to say to business. Because business is an expression of reality for all of us. It's the way that we go into the world and share our gifts and our contribution with each other and make parts of the world go round. And so it's intricately related with this nature of reality. But I have a very strong sense that what you say will be quite different from what most people would say about business.
I think yes and no. And I really share that perspective, Sarah. And one of the things, because I was walking between worlds since the age of 4, actually becoming an accountant actually grounded me very effectively.
I bet.
And also working in so many countries was fantastic for me in terms of learning a lot more about people and about how we interact as people. Because ultimately, I always saw organizations as organisms, and organisms that surely were structured, but were also at the heart were people finding ways of working together and collaborating together. I think for me, though, the nature of business as we've had it is based on a scientific paradigm, actually, that is 19th century science. It's a science of objects, of things, and a science of materialistic separation. And so the businesses that sort of emerged in the 19th century reflected what was seen then as the leading edge of science. But as a result, they became that sort of hierarchical way of being, which is very mechanistic. It's very transactional. It's very mechanistic. And although it served for a time, because I'm not going to do the blame game and go back and say, everything's been terrible and wrong. It's a journey, like our lives are journeys, human journey. And that journey of business from the first, the first writing, as far as I recall, in Sumerian was accountancy. It was tallying up who owed what for who and how. So, they say accountancy is the second oldest profession in the nicest possible way, but it goes back a long way. But the sort of businesses, the organizations, the structures that sort of emerged in the 19th century reflect the science of that time. And the 20th century science sort of threw that up in the air a little bit, and with quantum physics and relativity, said, things are much more about relationship and interrelationship, and the apparent separation between an observer and an observed is just that. It's the appearance of separation. And when we dig down and down and down, the nature of reality is something very different from its ostensible mechanistic appearance of separate objects. But all those clues as to the deeper nature of reality, and a reality where consciousness is primary, where, if you like, spirit, or that sort of discarnate higher vibrational aspect of the wholeness of the nature of reality is foundational, was pushed to the side. There was even, it may be apocryphal, but on a door of the University of Princeton was put up a notice saying philosophers keep out. So science went on, but it went on more technologically than, than foundationally. So business organizations didn't themselves change. they moderated over the sort of period of the 20th century. And then into the 21st century, of course, the internet sort of made that relational aspect very different. But at their base, there's still that old hierarchy, which is not just mechanistic, but also very male oriented. There's a sort of innate masculinity in the hierarchical way of doing things. But as things became more and more joined up and bigger, there's a realization, a growing realization of two things, I think. First of all, that hierarchies cannot handle the complexity of today's businesses, because they rely on a small number of people at the top filtering down all the wisdom. And that isn't the way that, first of all, it's not the way that nature operates. So the old way of organizations were antithetical to the way that nature works. And there's now a realization that we have to look to nature as our teacher as we grow from, progressive simplicity to complexity. And nature works by everything being interrelated with everything else. Everything is a co-creative, co-evolutionary partnership with everything else. But the biggest thing is that we're realizing with the new science that mind and consciousness aren't what we have. They're literally what we and the whole world are. So spirit of business is innately nurtured by this new holistic framework of the nature of reality itself. But what it's calling to us also, in my view, is that we moderate that very masculine, top-down, mechanistic, KPI-oriented, take the best of them, take the best of it, but then bring in more feminine aspects of what I call servant leadership, soul modeling instead of role modeling, seeing, sensing, shaping, and meld them, bring this sort of what the ancients call the sacred marriage into a much more holistic way of being and working, which we're already finding is much more conducive to positivity, well-being, and ultimate success, because that's how nature works. And if we learn from nature, if we learn from Gaia, we're far more likely to heal our relationship with her, but also to actually survive and thrive as a species.
There's so much in what you just said then, and there's so much to talk about, to get to understand every aspect of what you spoke about there. One of the questions that comes to mind is that, are you starting to see examples where what you're talking about with that masculine energy and feminine energy and nature examples and that sort of stuff is starting to come to the forefront, so we can start to see and visualize what you're talking about there in terms of the new ways of the world?
Yeah, and nature, I've just written my new book called Gaia, Her Story, and it's the story of a living, sentient, evolving planet in a living, sentient, evolving universe. And throughout 13.8 billion years of evolution, our universe actually embodies an innate evolutionary impulse to evolve from simplicity to complexity. But I use the word complexity, not complication. Us human beings are really good at complicating things. Nature is magnificent at complexity, because complexity has this innate ebb and flow of collaboration, where there is both competition and cooperation. But ultimately, through that evolutionary impulse, the collaboration moves from competition, still there, but it's more healthy. It's about excellence. It's about celebrating excellence, rather than, the old social Darwinism, in my view, misperception of survivalist competition, and becomes much more cooperative. And that, for me, is much more an innately feminine way of being. And I'm not just talking about women. The ancient tradition says we all have this innate universality within us of the masculine, feminine, and child attributes. And when we can bring the masculine and feminine together, they tell us that the child creativity is unleashed. If you think of a sort of a child sort of coming into beingness of creativity, but it requires the masculine and feminine to come together, those attributes within each of us, to really birth that child creativity, which is a child of wonder and a child of exploration and a child of just abundant openness to innovation and possibility. But it comes from a deeper perspective of that inner beingness of who we are, which I guess you, Sarah, Matt, you'd say this is the spirit of business. This is that spirit of business expressing itself.
To me, absolutely. It's and it's what I, in my own business, which is a small business, just this trying to find that spirit so that the business can work, like feels like a part of nature, rather than feeling like something that's been imposed from the outside as a framework or a structure of how we're supposed to do things because that's how other people do it. For it to become a living, breathing entity with a consciousness and with a spirit that's unique in a way to it, but it's linked clearly with everything. To me, like that's our daily dynamic of how do we do that, and how do we do that sometimes, you know, with people who are used to very different ways of doing business. And so there's it's not always easy for people. I think it's quite a big shift at times. And Matt and I have had many conversations around this topic. So Matt, I'm sure that you have some more observations on this.
Well, I think it's a good conversation, because we do often talk about nature in business and how there's a sort of a nice analogy that happens continuously in our conversations, Sarah, yours and mine, around, you know, what are we growing? Okay. You know, and we talk about sort of, you know, how things grow, and they don't necessarily just grow straight up. They sometimes grow sort of, you know, in this sort of intertwined way. And I liked what you're talking, Jude, about that nature element. And then also about this, you know, competition and then collaboration at the same time. So the natural flow and dynamic that goes on in our lives as well. But this concept of nature, and looking at nature as a sort of a pathway to get some guidance for us about what does the future of business look like. Because I really felt, especially before sort of, you know, the pandemic hit, that in business we're on a trajectory of unsustainability. And in some regards, the pandemic, whilst, you know, it's obviously hasn't been great for, you know, for lots of well-written reasons, one of the things it has done in a lot of our lives individually is probably calmed it down, and in some regards has calmed sort of not only our lives but our activity, and therefore sometimes the natural energy that goes on in the planet as well. And so I also look at that too. And you talked about evolution of business, and I can't help think about the way that nature works with the way that business works, with where we're at in the world and how that's evolving too, and the evolution of that as to how this all sort of starts to play out.
Absolutely. And a few just responses to both of you on that, from a perspective both of nature and of what we're starting to understand is essentially the leading edge of this organizational way of being in the doing of it. There's a gentleman called Frederick Laloux that you may have come across, who wrote Reinventing Organizations. And Fred talks about 3 attributes of this sort of leading edge, nature guided way of organizing. And he talks about, first is a holistic framework. In other words, to really begin to copy, to be biophilic in terms of sort of really reflecting natural processes, is this holistic framework. You know, an ecosystem operates in its health as a wholeness. So if we expand that to not just be the organization, but beyond, because we know that evolution is co-evolutionary partnership between an organism and its wider milieu, its wider environment. to the extent that, we're changing the language to go beyond environment, which suggests passivity and, something not quite connected. So we're talking about a holistic framework that now, with the new science, is offering us a universal cosmological framework of a conscious cosmology. And because it's showing us not only that everything in our universe exists and evolves as a unified entity and exists to evolve, it's showing us the fundamental nature, not just of interconnectedness and interdependence, but literally unity and diversity. So that's the biggest holistic framework we could have. But he also then talks about evolutionary purpose or purpose. And I talk about revolutionary and evolutionary purpose. In other words, for an organization to realize it not only has a purpose, it is purposeful by its very existence, but what is its evolutionary purpose? Because everything within what I call the Gaia sphere, the Gaia, Mother Earth, nature, is on its own evolutionary trajectory as part of a whole. The whole of Gaia is on an evolutionary trajectory. So as an organization, to play its role in that overall evolutionary purpose. And then the third thing he talks about is distributed intelligence. But distributed intelligence can only be optimized if there's coherence at that holistic framework and purpose. So if an organization has within all its people, its structures, its way of being, its way of relating, a holistic framework to what it is and what it does, and an evolutionary purpose to what it is and what it does, that offers the coherence, rather like an organism. We're 37 trillion cells of cooperative organism, yeah? We need to be coherent. Every bit of us has to work together for our health. Same with an organization. But then, although we think of our brains as being the sort of the master operator, our intelligence is distributed. Every cell of our body, whether it's a human cell or a bacterial cell or a fungal cell or a virus within us, has its own intelligence within that whole. So if we can actually develop organizations that have this holism, this revolutionary purpose, and then distributed intelligence, that for me is us reflecting and embodying nature in all her abundant glory. And I just finished by talking about distributed intelligence. There's a great film that we're seeing on the BBC at the moment called The Blob, Genius Without a Brain. And it's about slime molds. And if we have time, I'd love us to talk about slime molds because they are the most incredible beings. They're a single cell that is basically figures out complex solutions to complex problems as rapidly as essentially a supercomputer does. And lots of engineers do. So
I think you better talk about it right now, Jude.
Oh, okay, let's do it. They really are the poster folks for distributed intelligence. A slime mold is a single cell. It doesn't have a central brain. It doesn't even have a central nervous system. But what it does have is it has relationships within its cellular body that communicate incredibly intelligently. So if you put a slime mold in the middle of a glass plate and you put some of its favorite food, which is oat flakes, scattered around the plate, it will find the optimal way to reach that food. But when researchers did that exercise, did that experiment, they actually placed the oat flakes, the original experiments, placed the oat flakes around a slime mold to reflect the major transport system of the Tokyo metropolitan area in Japan. And the slime mold found all the food very quickly within a couple of hours. And when they mapped the metropolitan transport system onto what the slime molds had done, where the oat flakes had represented metro hubs, the slime mold had figured out the metropolitan transport system that had taken the engineers years and supercomputers to figure out. So they're literally now, researchers are using slime molds with oat flakes placed on hubs of networks that they want to model, and the slime molds are figuring it out before they need to use all this money with supercomputers and masses of engineers to do it. So that's what I mean by distributed intelligence.
And somehow what it makes me feel is that we really do have capacity also as human beings to figure things out, not in the complicated ways that we're used to, but with this incredibly sophisticated distributed intelligence. Not only it's distributed within us, because it's not just our brain, it's, so as you say, every cell, and also all the subtle senses that we have and that you clearly have developed. You were already using them when you were 4 years old. And then that, when we remember that everyone in a business has this extraordinarily sophisticated distributed intelligence, so it's distributed amongst us as well as within us, then we start to be able to make decisions in a very human way, like just, which to me is so powerful. It feels to me like that's what we're made for. And it's almost like we do ourselves down. It's no wonder so many people suffer with inadequacy, because it's like we're not really developing the superpower, the abilities that we really have. And so when I listen to that, I just feel like, oh yes, this is really good for human beings as well.
I listen to that and hear the simplicity in what you talk about, and you talk about simplicity, and then you talk about complex, and I think, and then I go into the normal run-of-the-mill businesses that we've all operated or been a part of, and so, well, how do you go from what you're talking about there to the day-to-day operations and mechanics of organisations and businesses as they stand at the moment? And how then do we make that transition from the complex that we actually are today into a better way that you're speaking about with that sort of simple existence?
It's such an important question, because we're at that point where the old mechanistic, separatist, hierarchical ways of being, which doesn't embody this distributed intelligence, and often the sort of the attempts at holistic framework are not, people don't walk their talk. You know, there's a lot of talk when I was in business. There's a lot of talk about values and you know, from the top and all the rest of it. But I came across so many people who, when the going got tough, ditched the principles and went into survivalist mode, not realizing that actually was, you know, ditching those principles was the last thing they should do. So I think there's so much here to unpack and explore. But I think two things for me. One is for us to literally learn from nature, from Mother Earth, from Gaia, because she does complexity. She does complexity from simplicity rather than complication. And that's a vast difference. An aircraft engine, somebody once said, an aircraft engine is complicated, a bowl of spaghetti is complex. And there's a really powerful difference. So if you actually go under the complexity of nature, you'll see innate simplicity. And you tend to see in networks of all sorts, and you can look at this across ecosystems, you can look across this in many, many other ways. But there are three things, which is shape, size, and stickiness. Those are the three simple attributes of every network. So the shape is like, how do nodes and networks connect with each other? And it seems that a threefold node, somehow the geometry of threeness is optimal. Stickiness is how then do you strengthen the connections? And the size is, you know, is the node sufficient of itself to have structural integrity that then can actually connect with the rest of the network? And if we actually build organizations from those simple principles structurally, but the key is still the level of coherence, and the level of coherence is absolutely predicated on this sort of wholeness, that the organization doesn't just see itself intellectually as a whole, but walks the talk of the beingness and the doingness of its wholeness. And then it as a whole really embodies and embeds a revolutionary purpose. What is it there to do? Who is it there to serve? What is it there to serve? And then, Sarah, what you were saying about the distributed intelligence can actually work optimally, can be and do optimally within that. But distributed intelligence, without the slime molds, cellular membrane and its innate interconnected communication within its cellular body, it couldn't do what it does. So it absolutely relies on that free flow of information, not just data, but meaningful formation to be the genius it is. And that's where the genius of distributed intelligence can really apply.
I want to pick up on this evolutionary piece because it seems to me, especially for small businesses, which is really what our podcast, we speak more to small business owners than very large organizations. It seems that small businesses are much more agile. It's much easier for them to change and to respond to what's going on in the world. Large organizations, like changing them, that's a whole different world. And I think there's a very important role for small businesses now to step up and become much more involved in that evolutionary purpose. And I'm very curious what you've seen, what your perspective is around the role of small business in evolution and where we are now.
Yeah, I agree wholeheartedly. I mean, every big business began as a small business.
Yes.
The thing is, and we find in evolution that what happens is that you come to, an organism can come to an evolutionary dead end. In other words, it's gone through its evolutionary arc and it can't go any further. It's so complex. We find, therefore, that, for example, and I'm not suggesting we do this because I don't like doing anything that seems to harm any organism. But if you cut off the head of certain worms, they will completely regenerate. They're complex, but not too complex to be able to do that and have a full body, revolutionary change. But we aren't. We might be able to in due course because we're now realizing that we are informational beings. So, but what we found through nature and evolution is there comes an evolutionary arc. So when an organism becomes very complex, instead of evolving itself, Gaia, nature, has a way of saying enough already, thank you, and then coming from a sort of a simpler basis, but the next arc of complexity takes the whole evolutionary process further along. And she's done that for 4 billion years. So small businesses, new businesses, are able to sort of embody this revolutionary purpose far more easily than the large businesses. Yeah. So I think they're very, very, very important. But the key thing for me is that to do so, they literally embody, this is where the spirit of business is, they embody the inner being to the outer doing of the folks that comprise them in the way that we've been exploring. Because then that as they grow, they can embody and continue to embody, as they become more complex, those principles. And if they're not, they too will go the way of the evolutionary enough already.
And that speaks to me of integrity, not just the old-fashioned kind of integrity of like I say what I do, but that integrity that is a wholeness, which you can't have if you don't embody, if you don't act. Like the being and the doing have to be united, and you can't just take action without any heed of the consequences or without any thought of what it's even doing to you inside. Like it all has to be one and the same thing, and there's a coherence there. And that's such a different way of doing business, because what I see and Matt sees all the time is people who really, they're willing almost to throw themselves away for the sake of what they're doing, for example, without realizing the consequences of doing that.
Absolutely. I'd love to hear from Matt on this, but I mean, I You know, the old saying is the end justifies the means. In my experience, the means become the end. So if you throw yourself away, that will be what ends. You know, you won't get what you want if you're not every step of the way the being in the doing of that. Sarah, I couldn't agree with you more. I think that's absolutely fundamental.
And I see this play out every day, that people have become obsessed with the end point of their business. You know, they grow their business for an exit or a succession plan or a finality associated with it. So therefore, it's a means to an end for them individually. And then as they get closer to the time they wanted to potentially, you know, sell or exit or move it on, sort of thing, some will continue on that particular journey, and others will then, you know, recognize that this is something, an expression of their life, a platform in which they can actually continually evolve their purpose and their being and themselves and express themselves from that point of view. So I certainly see the two distinct differences in regards to that with what you're saying there. And I think it is a journey, because a lot of people would say, yeah, if you talk to most business owners, they would say, well, I want to sell in 5 years' time, you know, and for X number of dollars, or 10 years' time for Y number of dollars. And they get very focused on this finality, and therefore this is just a living organism only for a period of time while it's under their sort of control. But I see the evolution, as you spoke about, Sarah, before, around how people change that focus and philosophy throughout. But then equally, you can see the pressures coming also where they go, I actually can't do this anymore. There's forces that stop them from wanting to do it. And then the business may naturally come to an end as well. So I see how all the different dynamics at play when you're talking about business as a living organism, all right, or as a living multiple cells, or the description for that. And I see how they all change and flex, and there's a dynamic that goes on. And I see it's just such an expression, business is such an expression of what you're really talking about there. And it has all examples as to what you're talking about.
Absolutely, it does. I mean, business is a part of a human natural ecosystem. I mean, one of the things that I wrote about in my last book, The Cosmic Hologram, and this goes back to what we're starting to say about, you know, this is a radical view of reality. And radical means root and branch. This is fundamental. This isn't, you know, this is an ancient new, but it's we've got the evidence more and more for it, that mind and consciousness are not just primary to the appearance of our world. They are our world. They are our whole world. But the point is that, you know, as such, we're finding that the underlying patterns that we find that underpin the causation that underpins ecosystems and natural systems underpins collective human systems. So we find, for example, the same patterns underlying ecosystems, whether they're rainforest or whatever they might be, underlying the internet. We find that collective human behavior actually embodies the same patterns as throughout the natural world, which is why the data companies are hoovering data, because actually that data is actually meaningful information around the way that people will behave. Now, we can behave, we have free will, we can behave in what way we do, but the point is we do behave collectively in the same patterns that pervade the natural world. And so when we understand the natural world, we understand ourselves actually better. We're not having this mistaken perception of somehow being separate from it. We're not. We're innately part of it. But we are self-aware, individuated aspects of a universe that is itself intelligent and evolving. So when we align with this evolutionary impulse, which is playing through the universe as a whole, which is playing through Earth, Gaia as a whole, we're aligning with the natural flow of who we are, both as human beings and as Gaians, which is a new term that I would love us to sort of step into. but also who we are at that wider, grander sense, where the spirit of business is embodied by the spirit of us.
And so what's your message then to business owners that actually are currently, operating businesses and running businesses on a day-to-day basis and navigating through the complexity of what they have to do and to, achieve their purpose and their goals and aspirations from that perspective? Taking all the things that you've learned, in your business world that now you've gone into, your new world, and then sort of coming back into the practicalities of back into business. What are the underlying teachings or strategies or advice that you give to business owners now that you've been in all aspects of the world?
Well, first of all, Matt, what I'd say is that this is not my new world. This is my old world that I then took a chapter that was called My Business Life.
Yeah.
And when I left that, I thought I'd left corporate life forever. And that was back in 96 or so. And then over the last, and then I was started to be invited to have the precursors to this sort of conversation, and realizing that it was far too early, that folks were just not anywhere near ready to be having this sort of conversation. And then about 10 years ago, so that was 96, about 10 years ago, again, there was another wave of invites to have these sort of conversations. And again, it was too early, but I could see people really, wanting this so much, but it was still sort of out there and it wasn't quite landing. And 2 years ago, I actually co-facilitated something at Findhorn in Scotland called the spirit of business. Would you believe? And there was a gentleman there that came from a major global consultancy organization and left after 2 days. I never heard from him again until recently. It's 2 years later. And that 2 days changed his life. And it took him so deep within himself that he realized that he was existing but not living in the role he had. And it really upended his life. But 2 years on, he is now the lead of a major initiative to bring conscious business into a global consultancy, because they're realizing that the folks they're dealing with are burning out because they're trying so hard. And it's leaving their deeper beingness at the door of their decision making. And there's a growing realization that is utterly unsustainable. So it's almost, in part, it's the pioneers who are knowing this and are setting up small businesses with the knowing of this and the commitment to living this. And it's other folks who are realizing that they are burning out and they cannot live the way they have been, and therefore looking for ways, such as yourselves, to say, please help us, we need this help. And it cannot be other than with integrity and authenticity. You cannot spirit wash this. You cannot spirit wash. There's been attempts at greenwashing which also are failing, but you cannot spirit wash. So unless you're ready to go into this place, this adventure, that I would say, please, 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 just trust me when I say it is the most awesome, incredible, wonderful adventure you'll ever be on. But you have to surrender to it. You can't try and control it. But if you surrender to it, all the expertise you have as a business person, the accountancy, the ways of being, but it calls you in a different way of expressing those, where you become a servant leader, not the leader, where you become a soul model, not a role model, where you sense and align and you actually authentically guide and encourage distributed intelligence within the coherence of the holism and the revolutionary purpose of what you and everyone in your organization says yes to.
It sounds amazing, and in terms of the consciousness and the connecting to the soul, as you say, and all the things that it does. You can just hear in your voice in terms of all the things that it just feels better. It feels more sustainable. It feels like it's going in the right direction from that perspective, and And Sarah and I have had lots of conversations about doing business in this particular way, as opposed to that sort of really hard pushing, as you say, leave conscious at the door sort of type way, as opposed to embodying it as part of what you're doing. So there's a real sense of that sort of wholeness as you're talking about. So yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, it's music. It's music for me, because it's like I know it, and I live and breathe that every day, and I'm sharing from it. It's a bit of a different perspective, but when I heard you speak, actually, Jude, the first time, I just felt like, oh my goodness, although your background is so different, it's like it's the same language somehow. It's the same fundamentally beautiful, deep human language. And I think the most important thing that I pick up in all of this, that is most dynamic when we look at the future of business, is that when we see ourselves as part of nature, which you've really talked about very beautifully, we don't have to do something to nature or do something about nature. So much of what we seem to be trying to do at the moment is to get business to fix nature. When we remember that we're actually a part of it, we don't need to fix it in that way. It's just like it automatically, we will find the patterns and find the ways of doing business that are natural, that are aligned with nature, and that resolves everything in a very beautiful, graceful way. And it's so much easier for us. So it's so beautiful to listen to you talk with all this scientific intelligence, business intelligence, and then this multi-dimensional intelligence that flows through everything that you're talking about. I would love to go on for another hour or 2 or 3, and we can't do that today. So I can just say thank you very, very much for joining us and for sharing your experience and your perspective with us.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Matt. And just to finish, I wholeheartedly agree. This isn't about fixing nature. She doesn't need fixing. She just needs loving. She just needs loving.
Thank you so much, Jude. It's been a great experience, and one that I'll always remember, and looking forward to having future conversations with you as well, because I'd like to get my practical business brain and my accountant's brain keeps going, but how? And I'd like to talk more about that aspect of it as well.
I'd love us to. Whenever you'd like to invite me again, I'll be here.
Thanks, Jude.
We'll do it. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Sarah. Thanks, Matt.
You've been listening to The Spirit of Business with Matt Murphy and Sarah McCrum. If you'd like some insight into the spirit in which you do business, a great place to start is by looking at your relationship with money. Find out more by taking the Money Scorecard at moneyscorecard.app, and we'll be back next week.